them off to implementation scientists who come up with strategies to implement the intervention, and I consider myself kind of off to the side. But I think that model has not worked very well, and I'm really eager to think about a whole new way of doing things, and not necessarily consider myself an interventionist. I can remain an organizational sociologist, but nevertheless facilitate the implementation of changes that stakeholders view to be important. And I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Sarah Birken. I'm at Wake Forest University School of Medicine.
Thanks, Sarah. So an implementation for the entire field. Excellent. We may come back to that. Okay. Thank you. And finally, Nick.
Thank you, Annette. And I think in introducing myself, I'll say that I think I'm in a sort of, and I have been, although I didn't realize at the time, in a sort of hybrid position, always employed largely by university, but in fact doing research that is actually, hopefully, also an intervention, if you like, or developing strategies to implement evidence-based practices within usually sort of large sort of secondary to tertiary care hospital organizations. And this is the sort of failure that I would like to share with the panel in the audience, which took place a number of years ago. I spent the first sort of 10 years of my postdoctoral career in the Department of Surgery over at Imperial College, and I used to do a lot of work, and I still do, in sort of trying to implement evidence interventions within sort of surgical, so perioperative care. And one of the interventions that many people today might have heard of, even those who don't necessarily work within surgery, is that there is a checklist that was inspired by what people do in sort of commercial aviation. The World Health Organization convened a panel who developed the checklist. It was a panel of doctors and so clinicians. It's known as the WHO's Surgical Safety Checklist, and it goes back to 2009. There's evidence, including trials, meta-analysis, and all sorts of things that have been produced to support the use of the checklist in real time when a patient goes through anesthesia, then surgery, then recovery. All the intervention is 3 pieces of paper. There's literally a piece that you put, you do when the patient is put to sleep, another one that you do when you're about to start an operation, and another one that you do when the operation is done. That is the intervention. So the intervention became mandatory for use in surgical care in the UK in 2009. Many places across the world, many continents, is exactly the same. But of course, as we know, the fact that something's been made mandatory doesn't mean it actually happens in practice, or it happens with any good fidelity at all. So a large sort of hospital in London a number of years ago sort of approached us, so myself and a group of other sort of applied health scientists, and they said, we know that the way we do the checklist isn't great. Even when people say that they've done it, they haven't really done it. They're talking about fidelity without using the term. And we thought, okay, great, we can actually address this. We've got evidence, we've got access to methodologies, we know how to help you with this, but we need a small research grant to do that. And they were very happy to oblige. So effectively, we set up a research grant for a year and a half, and I and a senior sort of implementation scientist worked together for this period to understand what the problem was, what the barriers were in doing and implementing this checklist well, the surgical pathways. So they actually funded us to do it. It was a bit almost like a consultancy project. So we threw you know, the works at it, from theory to stakeholder engagement. We did a roadshow. We did this across all different sites of this hospital. We went out to reach people who normally don't attend workshops, went to surgical wards. So, you know, we literally spent a year and a half with then doing this. And then we engaged with designers, because we thought a lot of healthcare material just looks terrible because they're not designed very well. So we engaged with designers, and they helped us design a really nice version of that checklist, which looks slightly different. It was totally adapted to what that hospital was doing and how surgical care was flowing, and indeed the concerns that were raised and the barriers that were raised in the process of consultation and stakeholder engagement. And when we did all of this, the people who sort of commissioned all the work said, oh, this looks brilliant. And we produced a report for them, and they said, actually, technically, you need this signed by the nursing director and the medical director of the entire hospital. And then we went to them, and they basically said within about 5 minutes of the meeting, before they even looked at any of the materials, they said, you do realize that we've had a number of never events, never meant so catastrophic, sort of difficult safety events in the surgical pathway. So these are the sort of things that make the news. And we decided we're going to redesign our checklist, and we've done this overnight. So that person designed it, the medical director designed it, and we're implementing it as of next week. So thanks very much, but we don't really want what you've just produced. And that was the end of the meeting. That's the shortest meeting I've ever had with a stakeholder in my life. It was really awkward because we're at a loss for words. We didn't really know what to say. I consider it a failure because it's an actual implementation failure. We could have published the study. I think we sort of lost faith at that point. We didn't even attempt to do that. And it to this day remains unpublished, which is a shame. We should have done it. But it's an investment, a financial investment. If you actually add the amount of hours that really senior consultants, so attending for our North American colleagues, attending level doctors, very senior nurses and managers took part to produce this new version, this new adaptation, and the fact that it was never taken anywhere, I consider it an utter implementation failure. In retrospect, the engagement did not reach high enough. I'm usually concerned about reaching high enough but not reaching the middle managers. This is a great example where we reached out, the middle managers were really keen, but the highest level of management in the hospital wasn't necessarily on board. And even if they had been on board, 18 months in a hospital lifespan is a very long period. So perhaps the pressures that we're faced with would have meant that the result of the project would have been the same anyway. So I don't know, these are just some reflections of what happened a few years ago.
Thanks, Nick, that's great. And I think these, both you and Julia have these kind of long scale reflections. I think that is part of our learning in a field, isn't it? It's the things you did that can feel like failures at some point, and sometimes things can be picked up again at some point. And actually, sometimes it's about the timeliness, or in your case, where the timeliness means people accelerate ahead of you in a dramatic way. Great, okay, that was brilliant. Thank you all of you, and also for being so succinct. We've got some time for questions, and we've got 2 already. So we have one in the chat, and this is for you, Alexis. Do you think traditional gold standard efficacy focused studies that set hard outcome measures at the start may actually be counterproductive when process measures or interim process early outcome evaluation indicates an iterative tailoring or a shift in outcome measures?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a couple of factors to address here. One is, I think we absolutely need to be studying a broader range of types of measures. So not just clinical service kind of intervention outcome measures, not just our traditional implementation outcome measures, but also things kind of broader upstream that I think are what implementation practitioners are really focusing on, which is more of that capacity building piece that I was talking about. So, in my role as an implementation practitioner, I see my role in changing how people think, how they approach change, how they start to build new systems, new processes for doing the things we want to do using the evidence. And so when I think about measures that are important, it's measuring, are we impacting how people think? Are we impacting kind of their use of these new tools that are in our toolkit that they can now use? So are they coming up with coaching service delivery plans, things like that? And I think those are really important because, as you point out, they can indicate a shift. So, when the one side I talked about developed this beautiful coaching service delivery plan, and then kind of executive leadership shut it down, that did result in a shift in our practice, where we then shifted to start to use implementation strategies that now focused on engaging executive leadership and building readiness for this type of change. And I think that the other thing that I'll mention briefly is just timeframes that we look at. And do we have enough time to really study all of these things? We tell our sites that if you really want to be successful in implementation of an evidence-based program or practice, you're looking at a 3 to 5 year timeline minimum. And so just thinking about the time frame in which we have to study these things as well.
That's great, thanks. There's a question for the whole panel from Brian Mittman, who says he'd like to hear your comments on the distinction between implementation failure and the failure of implementation research study. Sarah, would you like to have a go at that? That really follows on from what you were talking about.
So in some of our previous panel discussions, we've talked about the kind of definition of implementation science as the study of implementation strategies. And I really rail against that definition. I feel very strongly that that definition is too narrow. So it's very frustrating to be an implementation researcher in the US who doesn't believe that incremental studies of individual strategies or even combinations of fixed strategies will promote our understanding of implementation. So to me, most conventional funded, federally funded studies of implementation, this sounds a little probably more inflammatory than I mean, are failures because they don't get us fundamental understanding of implementation. So, you know, in conventional terms, a failed study is one where results are null or negative. I think we tend not to publish those and everyone kind of slinks away after the study is done. Whoops, our hypotheses were not supported. But in my mind, that's a real opportunity to think about, are we studying things the right way? Brian, I acknowledge that probably was not your question, but I used it to
it's a great answer. Julia, do you have any views on that one?
I feel like I'm a fully reformed implementation scientist switched on to the implementation practitioner side, so I don't think I have appropriate responses for the implementation science side of it.
Nick?
I think I would continue the strand that sort of Sarah started. I think we need to publish those. I mean, I think ever since we started having these briefing calls for this panel, I'm keep regretting now not publishing that study. And I think we have an editorial responsibility, and we have a scientific responsibility to publish the failure. It doesn't need to be. It could be that, you know, the implementation that where the actual implementation sort of impact, if you like, or the actual implementation on the shop floor failed, was supported by a really well-designed study. It doesn't mean that all the frameworks and strategies and everything else we do should always work in this aspect. The problem is that if we never publish studies that show that actually we didn't achieve the implementation that we thought we might achieve, for whatever reason, we have some good understanding of that. If we don't publish that, then we don't help accumulate the knowledge that the science is meant to be about. So I think to respond to Brian's point, personally, I think you can have a really well-designed study that ends up not really achieving the level of scale-up or implementation or fidelity or adaptation that you want, but that's not to mean that the study itself failed. But I think we're at that stage where I don't see very many of those studies getting published. I've seen some, but I think we can do more as a field to get these things out, these studies out there.
And there was just a study published on that about MST, multisystemic therapy in Australia. It was a fabulous paper. We just flagged it to feature in one of our upcoming bulletins. So I'll look for it and try to link it in the comments.
If you could, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
That'd be great. Thanks, Julia. We've run out of time, but I think we've ended in a great place, which I think it feels very clear to me from your comments, panelists, that there's such a lot we could learn from talking about our failures, and it feels quite refreshing to hear those elements. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about what's gone well and what's, you know, to sharing those successes, but maybe there's even more we could learn from this kind of element of our practice, because it is what sends you away to deeply reflect on what you've done and to particularly express concern for what feels like, particularly in Nick's case, like such an awful lot of effort for things not to pay off. So I think there's a real call maybe to the community to think about how we can really share this learning going forward, and maybe have more opportunities like this for people who are attending conferences to share that learning too. I hate people who run over, and that was a whole minute over, so it's horrifying. But I'm going to let you all go off to your various points in the day. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this panel. Finishing off what seems to me to have been an absolutely fantastic day. I was suspicious that this could work online, but I really think there are so many advantages, actually, and particularly for one of our panelists who couldn't have been here if it wasn't for it being online because of family commitments. So that's a great plus to engaging in this way. So have a lovely afternoon, evening, or to Belinda, back to bed, and see everybody in the morning. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.